Hello, people. Thanks for coming to my channel. And if you're new to the channel, you like the content, please subscribe. Um, I talk about a wide range of issues, social, political issues mostly, but I also occasionally do film reviews and other issues. So I cover a wide range of content. So what I want to discuss is justice. It's a subject I feel very strongly about. Anyone who's followed my channel for a while will be aware of that. It's probably the domestic issue that I feel strongest about, actually. This is partly from personal experience. I and my family have had experience in the past of serious antisocial behaviour to the point where we had to move house. I don't want to go into too many personal details just for privacy reasons, but um, it had an impact on me. I mean, it was 20 years ago, but it had an impact. Um, and that sort of feeling of being frightened, basically, to leave your own home is very unpleasant. But it has a long-term effect in terms of how you view these things. I've no problem saying that I'm a conservative when it comes to crime. I basically think if you hurt society, you have to pay a price. Not from vengeance, but from basic justice. That's what justice is to me. A while back, I got into a heated exchange with a left-leaning individual, and um, when we remonstrated on the meaning of justice, he came out with justice is all about forgiveness and about compassion. And I was, well, quite honestly, I was incensed because he was so far off the mark that, in my opinion, that yeah, I must admit I lost my temper a bit. Um, it is something I find hard to tolerate when people go out of the way to mitigate the effects that criminals have, and by basically trying to stand in the way of punishment, I think you're stealing something from the victim. You're stealing the right for the victim to have justice. But anyway, I've just watched an interesting video recently, like very recently, sort of over the past year. We've had a new policy whereby verdicts, not the whole trial, but just the verdicts of some high-profile cases are broadcast. That's very new for this country. Britain always, unlike the United States and some of our continental neighbours, we had never televised trials for a range of reasons. But as part of making the system more transparent, Dominic Raab, to his credit, pushed for more transparency. And so now we have a situation where verdicts are actually televised. Now, it's just the judge, so you don't see the defendants, you don't see the victims, you don't see relatives, you don't see lawyers. It's purely the judge reading out the verdict and explaining his or her reasons in doing so. I'm going to put a link to this video because it is important. Now, this is a particularly high profile case. It's about 16 minutes long, and the judge is going through it. The video doesn't name the judge, so I don't know who that is, but the video is going through the details of the crime, the background to the defendant, the background to the victim, and aggravating and mitigating factors. This was a particularly horrifying case. It was a case of a woman who murdered her friend, decapitated her for monetary gain. This was particularly heinous. This has been reported, you may have seen it in the last few days in papers. Sickening stuff. Now, everything I'm saying here is in the public domain. This is being broadcast by Sky News, so it's in the public domain, and I'll put a link to the video. But after talking a little bit about this, I want to talk more broadly about the justice system. Gemma Mitchell is the defendant, and she murdered her friend, Mi Kwan Chung. The mitigating factor, the judge sentenced her to life, but I'll come back to that because, of course, in this country, life doesn't mean life. But the mitigating factor, the only mitigating factor, was that she had previous good character. 38, she had one minor offence in the past. The judge considered that previous good character, but he pointed out that the gravity of the crime was such that it was basically disregarded. Aggravating factors was far more. She had no remorse. She was still in denial about what she had done, hence no remorse. It was for monetary gain, and it was particularly vicious. Um, so, what was her sentence? I have to say, I was surprised. She got 34 years for this. Now, by UK standards, some would say it should be a whole life tariff, but it is important to note by UK standards, that's actually a pretty stiff sentence. So I was surprised by that. I was thinking, okay, he's going to give her 15 years or maybe 20 years. 34 years she got. I think it's about right. I would have given her a whole life tariff because of the particularly, but under the context of what we see in this country, 34 years actually is a pretty long sentence. She'll be near 70 when she comes out. In fact, if she's 38, she'll be 72. And that's before any parole is considered. So she might actually spend the rest of her life in prison. Um, so once they get it right, I always think it's important to, when the justice system does get it right, to acknowledge it. Because I have been scathing. I've been very critical of the justice system. So this judge got it right in this case, but I still maintain that there are far too many cases where they don't get it right and where aggravating factors are not duly considered. An example of this is when you have offenders. I mean, in this case, the judge looked at her background and she had one minor offence, hence relatively good character up until this heinous crime. Um, I'm pleased that was disregarded. It should have been. You know, you can live like a saint for 70 years, then commit an evil act. That, that should be the thing that matters. But what I would say is that there are cases where you see offence after offence after offence. This is particularly the case with reckless drivers, where you see them re-offending time after time, or youth offenders, where they have a string of offences, or burglars, a string of offences, and that is still not wholly considered in the sentence. So I think there's a lack of consistency among judges. I've been pretty scathing of them as a profession. I suppose as a caveat, and to be fair, I should say not all judges are incompetent, not all judges are out of touch. Um, it'd be wrong to say that every single one of them is not good at the job. It is a difficult job. They do have to weigh up critical information. They are making grave decisions about um, the impact on victims, and putting someone in prison for a long time is not a small thing. So of course they're in a difficult job, but they don't face the sort of scrutiny that politicians do. They're not elected. They're not public figures. I have a problem with that. I'm not saying that judges should be elected necessarily, but I do think that the public should have far, far more empowerment to hold weak judges to account. What do I mean by this? If there is a judge who's known to have a track record of issuing disproportionately soft sentences, he or she should be held to account. There should be some sort of recourse for that person to be recalled or for their job to be on the line, quite frankly. Because if you are in a position of power and you're inspiring no public confidence, I mean, when a minister messes up to the point where the public are infuriated, there's pressure on the Prime Minister to give them the sack. At the moment, that's happening with Suella Braverman. Whether it happens or not, we'll see. But my point is, politicians are under a lot more personal scrutiny than judges. But why should a backbench MP face more scrutiny than a judge? I would say they're both in a position of power. In fact, I would say an average High Court judge arguably has more power than an average backbench MP. So why shouldn't they face more scrutiny? This is one of the main things I think needs to improve about our justice system. I think there needs to be far, far more public empowerment. I do think Dominic Raab was quite good Justice Secretary. He done some good things. For example, giving victims more of a say in parole hearings. That was a good move. That's to be welcomed. Like I say, having verdicts televised, that's good. Now, it might make no difference to what the verdict actually is, but maybe if judges know that they're being filmed, they'd be less tempted to ignore aggravating factors, as I feel some of them do. Um, Certainly in the case of repeat offenders. Um, so I think one of the major things that needs to change is accountability. I think that the Sentencing Council, these are the people, they tend to be made up of barristers and legal professionals. None of them are elected politicians. so they're unaccountable in that sense. Um, I don't have a high opinion of the Sentencing Council of England and Wales. I've had a few exchanges with them. I think they're quite self-congratulatory. I mean, if you look at the website, they're very big on, what they do, but they don't really address public anger, and they have this rather patronizing section of sentencing myths, but a lot of it isn't really supported by lived experiences and by the real world. For example, they have this whole thing about judges are not out of touch. They deal with these cases every day, but that ignores the fact that there are cases and there are individual judges. People do strongly feel they're out of touch. So simply them playing the devil's advocate for judges isn't enough. What about democracy? What about the idea that people actually feel this person is not good at the job and need to be held to account for it? Why should it be a case of we know best? Um, I got into another test exchange with a lawyer actually. Supposedly he was a defense lawyer, at least that's what he said. But this was on a public debate forum, and he got very defensive and he said his words were the public are idiots and they're just reactionary and emotive. And the whole attitude he was taking was very condescending and very much, well, the public are emotional, so they can't be trusted. To hell with them. My response to that was, of course, justice cannot be determined on emotions alone. Of course, it has to be determined by the facts. That should be the principal guiding thing. But that little exchange was quite telling about the arrogance of the legal establishment. I do think it's arrogant. I do think it's out of touch. Because I think these people live in a bubble. Again, I'm not generalizing. There are good judges out there, there's good lawyers out there. But I think the legal establishment as a whole, by which I mean judges, by which I mean the sentencing council, by which I mean the parole board, by which I mean lawyers, I think as a legal establishment, as that whole world, I don't really think they get public anger. Um, because they're clinical, they look at the facts of each case. That's fine. That's necessary. But I do think they need to respect public anger. They need to understand public anger. They need to understand public disillusion. And again, I'm not generalizing. Some of them do. Some of them do get it. Sometimes we hear judges express their own frustration saying, my hands are tied. Well, how much are their hands tied? Because this is often a refrain of judges that they would like to impose a higher sentence, but their hands are tied by the sentencing council. Okay, so let's put more pressure on the sentencing council. But there's a little bit of a blame game at stake here because often ministers will themselves condemn soft sentencing. Yet they're the legislators. Judges will just throw it back and say, wait a second, you're the one setting the laws. So I think we are at a point because public empowerment and a public sense of confidence is so necessary in terms of building that bridge. I think it is essential that there is actually more cooperation between the Ministry of Justice, the judiciary, and the Sentencing Council, and all these groups of people that are making the decisions, basically. Now, I get the argument. We have an independent judiciary. You can't have ministers dictating individual sentences. I totally appreciate that. I get it. That's what happens in totalitarian states. But in the end of the day, it's political parties and governments that make pledges to the public about getting tougher on crime. So that's meaningless if they have no power to actually do it. Therefore, I think there should be more government intervention when it comes to sentencing. A lot more government intervention. I'm not saying that ministers should interfere with due process. That is not what I'm saying. I'm saying when the facts are known, when a guilty sentence is passed, that's when it matters. And yes, it's down to the decision of the judge. It's the judge who's dealing with the facts of the case. But I do think that this idea of, well, politicians can't say anything because they'd be interfering, that's quite evasive. And I think it's kind of, it's a distraction because it's a way of saying, well, we can't be, you know, they shouldn't say anything because they're interfering. But my question is, if politicians don't hold them to account, the public don't have the power to do it, who holds judges to account? Who holds the sentencing council to account? If politicians can't do it, who? The public? Well, then give us the power to do it. I'll give an example of where this empowerment is not existing. Um, as it stands, if people feel that a sentence is unduly lenient, anyone can complain about that. I or you, anyone can complain about it. But the chances of anything changing are next to zero. I'll tell you why. What's the process? You write to the Attorney General of England and Wales. It used to be Sir Wella Braverman. I'm not sure who it is under Sunak's cabinet. But anyway, he or she then will look at the case. And if they agree, they will then refer it to the Court of Appeal. Very occasionally, there was one case recently, a horrible case, where someone had actually abused a child, a baby, I believe. Um, I don't even want to repeat the details of that. It was so horrendous, but it was deemed to be unduly lenient, and that sentence was actually increased. But that showed the incompetence of the judge in the first place. That's why I don't accept the line that judges aren't out of touch. Some of them absolutely are out of touch. Anyway, it did get overturned, but the number of cases that actually get overturned by the Court of Appeal are minimal. Now, I know this to be true because I contacted Mold Crown Court in Wales over a particular case that they presided on, and they sent me this link actually to cases that have been referred to the Court of Appeal and the number of, because I brought this issue up. And it was basically this, it was like an index of cases. Um, if I can put a link, I will, but it was some time back. I'm not sure if I still have that. But it was quite telling. It was quite telling because the number of cases that were actually overturned were minimal. Many of them were not even referred. So there has to be a much um, better way of the public saying this is not good enough. Now, I get it. I get it. People who don't have legal expertise are not experts, right? So, Jill and Joe Public, the argument might be they're not best placed to make a judgment on a particular case. Okay, they will not be sitting on the jury. They will not have the legal knowledge of judges and barristers. I totally get that. Lawyers, I should say. Um, but does public opinion count for nothing? I don't agree with that. Why does it matter? It matters because if the public have no faith in the justice system, that's a devastating situation. If they have no faith in the justice system, then ultimately they'll be reluctant to even report crime. And then you're going to have a lot of crimes going unreported because they think, well, the police aren't going to show up. And even if they do show up and the criminal's apprehended, they'll get a tap on the wrist from a judge. Now, as I said at the start of the video, this is not always the case. Sometimes sentencing does match the gravity of the offence. Not always. One of the things I feel strongest about is youth crime because I think that is one area where the system is far, far too soft. If you have a 16-year-old thug, he or she is old enough to know right from wrong. And we still have this really infuriated me. The Ministry of Justice, when I brought up this issue recently, they kept referring to them as children. Yet the law itself recognises that in England and Wales, 10 is the age of criminal responsibility. A 16-year-old is a teenager. I mean, my goodness, you can take a driving test at that age. You can legally have sex. There's things you could do. You're basically a young adult. Um, so, anyone who's ever had to deal with a youth gang, to just dismiss them as children is utterly evasive and ignorant. Um, and that showed to me that the Ministry of Justice is out of touch. The fact they kept referring to this. Now, they claim that actually there is punishments that take into account of seriousness of the crime, but they also clearly said when it comes to youth crime, the rights of the young offender have to be taken into account, not the victim, the young offender. I think it is absolutely preposterous. I think I'd raised actually the issue of adults defending themselves from young offenders, and they claim that well, self-defense is an old defense in English law, but if you are, say, a man in your 30s like me, and you're attacked by a youth gang, if I punch a 16-year-old, I'd be charged with assault, even if I was basically fighting for my life. That's what's so perverse about our system. Our system enables young offenders, and it infuriates me. I think there need to be much, much tougher penalties. But I get it. If you have A teenager who has a sex worker mother and a heroin addict father, or a heroin addict mother and a father who's been in prison for burglary, clearly that's not a good upbringing. So clearly there has to be root causes looked at. There has to be all that parenting, all of that. Let's tackle that. Definitely, let's tackle that. But I still insist after the fact, there has to be justice. And if you have a remorseless offender, um, he may come from a broken home, she may come from a broken home, but that makes no difference to the victim, quite frankly. There has to be accountability. Um, and if you have someone who's remorseless, who's a repeat offender, I mean, I saw a video a while back of a pensioner in Birmingham being harassed by youth gangs. This is happening all the time in this country. Why? Because they feel enabled. They feel enabled because the sentencing council is useless, and the sentencing council enables them. So I think the sentencing council need to face much, much more public pressure on issues like youth crime. They need to get themselves into the real world, understand public anger, and make sentencing tougher. Because, judges might blame politicians or they might say their hands are tied. Well, if the sentencing council raises the minimum sentencing, then judges can't say that their hands are tied. They would have to impose that. Let me give an example. If you have a gang that terrorize a young family and force them to leave their homes, a community sentence isn't good enough. They should be sent to Borstal. They should be given custodial sentences. I personally would favour a scared straight approach or something that is creative, something that makes them scared, rather than just this situation where they literally laugh at justice. You cannot have a situation where teenagers are terrorizing adults and they're just running around and doing as they please. I say teenagers, sometimes even 12-year-olds. This is definitely parenting's a big part of it. I also think it's because the deterrents are so soft. If you are a 15 or 16-year-old and you're given a tap on the wrist and told to do a bit of community service or given an ASBO or something like that, that's not a deterrent because these teenagers are hardened. They're not scared of that, so they need something that really scares them. I would actually favour some sort of national service specifically for young offenders, not to stigmatise all young people, specifically for young offenders. But that's only for the more minor offences. I think for more serious offences, prison definitely. Not saying adult prison, young offenders institute, but it has to be custodial. But I know from experience that we have this situation where youth gangs run wild and there are no real consequences. There's no real deterrent. They'll get a tap on the wrist. They'll probably get a police warning. They might be put on some sort of register, maybe do some community service, but there's no real deterrent. That has to change. I think we need to get much, much tougher with youth crime and stop making so many damn excuses for them. I think the sentencing council needs to stop making excuses for them. They should be putting victims first every time. Every time. Whether it be youth crime or whether it be adult offenders, victims should always come first. The other point, of course, is often the victims of young offenders are other young people. That horrendous case near where I lived, young Jack Woodley, killed by a pack of teenagers. I mean, cases like that are so depressing and so frightening, actually. Now, in my opinion, the one who killed him should get a minimum of 20 years. The others should get at least 10 to 15 years, at least, because they were all part of it. None of them tried to stop the killer. If you're familiar with the case, it's just horrifying. You can imagine his last seconds. Um, I think there need to be much, much tougher penalties against youth gangs. Anyway, thanks for watching. But these are issues I feel very, very strongly about, and I think that at the moment I feel powerless. There's minimal I can do. But to sum up, I think there's a few things that have to change. Some things have improved. The fact that verdicts are televised is good. The fact that victims have more say in parole hearings is good. But there's still far, far too much that is not good enough. I think the sentencing council needs to be more accountable. I would favour at least their head being elected, akin to police commissioners. I would favour much tougher penalties for violent young offenders. I'm not saying if you have, for example, a 15-year-old who's been pressured by his friends to say shoplift, then he should immediately be sent to prison. That's probably too excessive. But if you have a 15-year-old who stabs someone to death for disrespecting them, or who is harassing a pensioner, or anyone for that matter, um, this enabling culture that we have of young offenders has to end. It's too soft, put simply. And I'm sick and tired of these left wing social worker types. And again, I don't want to stigmatize all social workers, but frankly, it's predictable. They tend to be the people who will speak out against any form of punishment. Oh, we just need to educate them, and we just need to sit them down with a nice cup of tea and tell them to please not hurt people. That's naive. It's naive. Anyone who's ever had to deal with a hardened young offender will know that they're absolutely remorseless. They're dangerous. So you need a much, much tougher system that will make them actually fear the law rather than laugh at it. So yeah, those are things I think need to improve. Much more accountability from the sentencing council. Much more pressure on them to actually get tougher sentencing, tougher penalties for young offenders. And finally, more empowerment of the public. I think weak judges need to be held to account. I think if all of these things can happen, it would improve trust. Because people would actually start to see a system that is recognizing public anger, is recognizing this public burning desire to see justice. I think if you were to do a vox pop, the vast majority of people don't trust the justice system. They believe it's too soft. I think if you were to do such a poll among victims of crime, they would feel that way. Excuse me. So clearly something has to change. I am not talking here, I want to be very clear about this. I'm not talking about getting out pitchforks and, just justice by mob. That is not what I'm saying. But actually, the chances of that sort of thing happening, the chances of vigilante justice happening increase when there is a perception that the system is soft. So the system needs to understand public anger. I don't believe it does at the moment. I think the bureaucrats at the Sentencing Council of England and Wales do not understand public anger. It has to change.